Bath, 1815. Candlelight spilled across the grand ballroom of Westland House, turning polished floors into a mirror where the cream of society watched itself whirl. In a half-hidden alcove, behind velvet curtains heavy enough to silence a scandal, Miss Adah Primrose stood facing the most powerful man in the county. "Marry me immediately," she blinked. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace." The Duke of Harrington, Andrew Percy to those who never dared call him that, held himself like a ledger line, straight, precise, impersonal. His gray eyes were the color of winter sky over the downs. "I said you should marry me," he repeated as if noting rain. "Rumors about your impropriety are multiplying, and certain whispers have had the poor judgment to connect your name to mine." Heat climbed out his cheeks. "They're unfounded." Mr. Wilson fell from his horse. "I gave him a handkerchief. A clean one." She swallowed. "There was nothing improper." "Perhaps," he said evenly, "but you were unchaperoned. Mr. Wilson is a practiced flirt. Society has drawn its conclusions." "Let them talk," Adah said, lifting her chin. She had lost a father 3 months ago and found a spine in the process. "I've never lived by their opinions." Something like respect tightened, and then released the corner of his mouth. "Commendable, not practical," his voice lowered. "Without protection, these rumors will smother your chances at a respectable future. Your father's passing has left you exposed. I can remedy that. I require an heir. I require a duchess above reproach." She stared. The Ice Duke, impeccable, efficient, emotionless, a man known for perfect manners and a permanent frost. "You speak of marriage like a contract," she said softly. "Is it not?" One brow rose. "Emotion clouds judgment. Clarity secures outcomes." On the ballroom floor, a reel spun bright and careless. In the alcove, time steadied. Adah remembered the cottage on the edge of Bath, the ink on her fingers from cataloging her father's books, the quiet surety that spinsterhood could still be a full life if it was an honest one. She had never minded the word, until now with a future narrowing by whispers she could not control. "What would this clarity require of me?" she asked. "Dignity, discretion, stewardship. We will marry at once and make an end to gossip." She hesitated, then surprised herself. "I would require certain freedoms." The Duke's posture shifted by a degree. "No more, no less." "Clarify." "I will continue my charitable rounds. I will write to my friends unimpeded." Her palms dampened inside her gloves. "And I will have access to your kitchens." That pierced the frost. "My kitchens?" "I enjoy cooking," she said quickly, before she could lose courage. "Not as a duty, for pleasure." His gaze flicked over her as if recalculating a column no one else had noticed. "You wish to cook?" "Yes." A long beat. Then to her shock, "Very well, so long as you do not interfere with the staff." He extended his arm, decision made. "Do we have an agreement, Miss Primrose?" It was absurd. It was practical. It was a door opening when the corridor seemed to end. Adah slid her hand along the black cloth of his sleeve. "Yes, Your Grace." "Excellent." He guided her back into the light. "We shall be married within the fortnight." As the orchestra swelled and the dancers turned, Adah let herself be carried toward the next thing and tried not to think about the life she had just agreed to with a man carved from winter. The morning after the engagement, Adah sat in her small drawing room, attempting a letter to Charlotte Haywood, the friend who told the truth and expected it back. "You will think me mad," she wrote, "but reserve judgment until I explain." A knock. Mrs. Winters, her housekeeper, appeared breathless. "Miss, there's a carriage with the Harrington crest, 4 footmen, and a lady says she is the Duke's sister." Adah stood so fast her chair scraped. "Already?" Lady Eleanor Percy filled the doorway a moment later. London cut and country confidence. The resemblance to her brother was there in the eyes, but where his seemed shuttered, hers were bright. "Miss Primrose," Eleanor said, warm as a firelit parlor, "forgive the early call. My brother wrote to me last night. I drove down at once. I had to meet the woman who persuaded him to do the improbable." Adah curtsied, acutely aware of how humble the cottage must look to a woman who knew townhouses and town talk. Tea? In a moment. Eleanor took in the room, the books, the clean but mended curtains, the ink stains, then nodded as if a private sum had come right. Andrew has refused a dozen excellent girls in as many years. The Tun decided he would never marry. And now, she flashed a grin. Here we are. In the small parlor over steam rising from the best china Adah owned, Lady Eleanor was frank. Their father had been a cold man. Their mother died young. Andrew had learned that feelings were liabilities other people could use. He is fair, she said, generous with tenants, tireless about the land, but he does not know how to be warm in public. He keeps warmth where no one can touch it. Adah listened, the Duke reframing from marble to something more complicated. Why me? She asked before she could stop the question. Eleanor's eyes softened. Substance. You have it, and perhaps you don't fear him. Adah thought of last night's negotiation. Perhaps. Now, Eleanor said briskly, setting down her cup. Practicalities. Harrington Hall will host a quiet ceremony. We will see two modistes this afternoon. It will be my wedding gift. Do not argue. Adah tried. Adah failed. By sunset, there were fittings and fabrics she had only ever seen in shop windows. Eleanor was exacting, kind, and unmovable. A duchess is a language other people read, she said. Let the dress speak for you until your voice can. Marriage to the Ice Duke was exactly as advertised. Courteous, efficient, distant. Separate chambers. Dinners like well-run meetings. He discussed estate yields and parliamentary votes as if they were weather. He touched her hand only when custom required it. On the third morning, Mrs. Fairchild, housekeeper of 30 years and guardian of every tradition, arrived with a ledger that could stun a bull. Her Grace, if you can follow the accounts, she said, tone implying it would be charming if she could not. Adah smiled. Thank you, Mrs. Fairchild. I'll review them weekly. A flicker, approval or surprise moved across the older woman's face. The Duchess's parlor has not been used since Her Grace's mother passed, she added after a pause. It has good light. They opened windows no one had opened in years. Dust sheets came off like old certainty. Behind a tapestry, Adah found a narrow door and a hidden stair. The Duchess's passage, Mrs. Fairchild explained. It leads to the kitchens, the late Duchess sometimes observed. Observed, not baked. Adah's heart lifted anyway. How convenient, she said too quickly. I may make use of it. Mrs. Fairchild drew herself up, lines of propriety sharpening. Her Grace will, of course, refrain. His Grace gave permission, Adah said gently, and left it there. Before dawn the next day, sleepless and hungry for something that belonged to her alone, she lit the kitchen hearth. Copper gleamed like a sunrise. The pantry was a storybook of ingredients in neat labeled lines. Flour, butter, apples, cinnamon. Her mother's voice quiet as breath. Cold butter, gentle hands. Adah worked until rhythm replaced nerves. Dough came together under her palm. She hummed without meaning to. The room smelled like comfort. Your Grace! She jumped. Flour bloomed from her sleeve like smoke. The Duke stood in the doorway in riding clothes, eyes taking in the scene. Her, the neat rows of tarts, the heat of the oven. I didn't expect anyone awake, she said, catching her breath. I ride at dawn, he said, stepping in. His gaze moved, not critical, but curious. What are you making? Apple tarts, a touch of nutmeg. She heard her own voice steady. My mother's recipe. He reached for a bit of cut dough, considered it as a specimen. You enjoy this labor? It isn't labor when done for pleasure, she said before she could edit. Don't you have any pleasures that aren't duty, Your Grace? A corner of his mouth tilted, almost a smile, swiftly mastered. I ride for pleasure. I read scientific journals. I appreciate a good brandy. A pause. That may not be what you meant. She slid a tray into the oven. Would you stay and taste one? They won't be long. He hesitated, then sat at the scarred wooden table with the gravity of a man taking a seat in Parliament. When she set a tart before him, he examined it as though he might sign it into law. First bite, second. His lashes lowered, then lifted. This is, he searched for a word that did not bend often to his service. Exceptional. Adah felt the praise like warmth through a chill. Thank you, Your Grace. A breath. Then, Andrew, he said quietly, when we are alone, you might call me Andrew. It was nothing. It was everything. A small door, opening. Then you must call me Adah, she replied, hardly above a whisper. He finished the tart with an appetite she had not seen in the man at dinner. What else do you make, Adah? Bread, cakes, puddings, honey biscuits when the day begs for them. He stood too abruptly, as if he'd felt himself leaning. I must see my steward. A glance at the oven. Perhaps you might continue your culinary activities if it pleases you. He left before she could answer. The kitchen felt larger after he was gone, and warmer. Adah looked at the second tray, rising beautifully in the heat, and understood, for the first time since the wedding, something between them had shifted from necessary to wanted. Harrington Hall changed by inches once Adah claimed the Duchess's parlor in the early kitchen hours as her own. Doors opened to light, drafts thinned beneath new rugs. Even Mrs. Fairchild's voice felt half a tone gentler when she announced the day's schedule. The house was not warmer because the fires burned higher. It was warmer because someone finally stood near them. Lady Eleanor arrived again before a week had passed. Her pelisse the color of moss after rain, her smile a small rebellion against November. She swept into the parlor with a brisk kiss to Adah's cheek and a quick assessing look. Good. You've reclaimed the windows. Air and sun are terrible gossips. They tell the truth. Eleanor turned, calling over her shoulder. Footman, the dress boxes to the blue bedroom. Not the green one. The blue has better light. More fittings? Adah asked, both grateful and overwhelmed. Fewer, Eleanor said. Today is not about silk. It's about stance, pace, and where to place your gaze when you would rather place a candlestick. Come on, Adah, walk with me. They walked the long west corridor, the one lined with family portraits. Stern men, beautiful women, a boy with eyes full of summer and a grin that did not belong to the household's later reputation. Eleanor slowed there, just long enough for the boy in paint to do his quiet work. That one? Adah asked softly. My brother at 11, Eleanor said. Before. The word did not need a companion. Adah stood a fraction closer to the portrait, without quite meaning to. The painted boy's mouth held mischief. His posture did not know yet how to be a wall. Andrew is not cold, Eleanor said, gentle and exact. He is defended. People confuse the two, and then treat him according to their confusion, until it becomes true. You will unconfuse them. How? Adah asked, half a joke, half a prayer. By being yourself without apology. Eleanor linked arms. By letting room see what you see, that he is fair, thorough and watchful in the way of men who expect to be struck, and by returning kindness for curiosity until curiosity tires and kindness is the only thing left standing. They practice the easy things that are only easy when someone shows you how. How to enter a room and let conversation find you. How to be still without seeming silent. How to decline. How to accept. How to let a question pass through you like light and not be captured by it. Eleanor turned poise into steps Adah could learn. Northbrook, Eleanor announced at the end of the morning. 2 days, a small party, fresh air, music, a chance to be seen without being devoured. Something bright sparked in her eyes. And, if the weather cooperates, a dance. A dance, Adah echoed, unsure whether the word meant terror or something like hope. That afternoon in the kitchens, Adah stirred lemon curd over the gentlest heat, coaxing it into silk. She heard the soft footfall she had begun to know. Does the schedule allow an audit? Andrew asked, voice level, eyes not on the copper pot so much as on the person attached to it. It allows a spoon, she said, offering one. He tasted, considered, and nodded once. Precise, he said, which for him meant very good. There's a house party at Northbrook, she said, pretending to check the heat as if she hadn't been thinking about little else since Eleanor's announcement. Your sister promised fresh air and a small crowd. And music. My sister promises many things, Andrew said, the ghost of humor at the edge of his mouth. She usually gets half of them, which is more than most people manage. Will you go? Adah asked, then added, will we? He set the spoon down with care, as if the question were made of glass. Yes, he said at last. We will. It should have been an ordinary answer. It felt like a decision that leaned toward her. Northbrook Manor wore November kindly, low stone walls warmed by ivy, long lawns trimmed neat as thought, a terrace that looked across a valley already thinking about winter. The arrival hour turned the gravel drive into a polite parade. Coaches, the soft thunder of hooves, laughter pitched to carry. Adah felt a tremor of all the old considerations, dress, voice, which fork when, but the sensation dissolved when she felt Andrew's hand at her elbow as he helped her down from the carriage. Not possessive, attentive. Eleanor appeared at once, a hostess in her natural habitat, cheeks bright, delight genuine. You're here, she said, and somehow made the words a welcome rather than an observation. We've a dozen guests, a true dozen, Andrew, not one of my creative counts, and tea waiting on the east lawn. Tea, Andrew repeated in a tone that suggested he understood the word's social uses and accepted them for the afternoon. The east lawn glittered with people who looked like the inside of a fashion plate and laughed as if nothing terrible had ever happened to them. Adah breathed, found the count Eleanor had taught her, 4 in, 4 out, and let the scene come to her in pieces. A gentleman's loud waistcoat, a lapdog jeweled like a duchess, ladies in conversation that looked like a braid. Duchess of Harrington, someone murmured, and the braid loosened. Eyes turned, curiosity careful but keen. Adah met looks the way she had learned to meet the heat of an oven, without flinching, without letting it burn. It did not take long for Lady Hensley to find her. Lady Hensley had the skilled smile of a woman who had arranged 1,000 tables and believed people belonged in the same categories as forks. Bath, is it? The lady asked, fan-flicking. I cannot recall the Duke spending much time there. And your father was… what was it? Ah, yes, a professor. Medieval sundries, I'm told. Charming. Medieval agriculture, Adah said, refusing to let the corners of her mouth harden. His work on 14th century land tenure remains definitive. How unusual, Lady Hensley said, tasting the word the way some people taste vinegar. Unusual things, Adah said, are often useful. Lady Hensley's fan paused, then fluttered on, as if discouraged. And your wedding, quite modest. One would have thought, well, perhaps propriety and speed were considerations. Both, Adah said calmly, and sincerity. It would have continued. Lady Hensley had an endurance for insinuation that would have made a marathoner proud. But at that moment a familiar presence took the air beside Adah and altered its temperature. My wife's father was a distinguished scholar, Andrew said. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His correspondence on historical land management directly assisted modernization of Harrington's farms. Our tenants prospered from his thinking. I consider that neither unusual nor charming, Lady Hensley. I consider it excellent. Silence arrived first like a well-trained butler. Then the rustle of conversation resumed, but it resumed around them, not through them. Lady Hensley inclined her head. Naturally, she said, and found a reason to admire a shrub. Adah felt her breath return, slow even, and realized he was still there at her side, as if he had not stood there on purpose, but had simply always been part of her weather. Thank you, she said softly, when no one in particular looked at them. I dislike inaccuracies, he said. It was his way of offering, I see you, and I will not let anyone else miss what I see. Eleanor materialized with the uncanny timing of a woman who understood the movements of storms. A tour of the gardens, she announced to no one and everyone. Do come, Duchess. And you, brother, since you pretend to enjoy botanical classification. She gave him a look both wicked and affectionate. Pretend convincingly. They walked. Andrew identified plants with exactness. Adah asked questions whose answers were not social, and the conversation turned from who to what and why. When they reached the far edge of the lawn, where the neatly clipped world loosened into a wilder copse, Adah paused. I am beginning to understand your land, she said. My land? His brows drew together. How you think of it, she clarified. Not as a ledger you balance, but as a living thing you tend. The line between his eyes eased. I suppose that is accurate, he said, the word careful as if it might startle and run. It is a system, people within it, patterns. If something strains, you fix the cause, not the symptom. And people? She asked, too curious to filter it. Do you fix people? No, he said, immediate. You cannot. You can only remove what hurts them, if you are lucky enough to see it. They stood a moment with that, the afternoon tilting into something softer. Somewhere behind them a violin began to test its strings. Music, Eleanor called across the lawn. At last. Chairs scraped. Couples arranged themselves by instinct and memory. Adah felt absurdly like a girl at the edge of a lake, wondering if the water would be colder than it looked. Andrew turned to her as if the thought had touched him too. He did not clear his throat as men do when they are about to be brave. He simply asked, "Would you care to dance?" It should not have mattered. It did. The Duke of Harrington asking his wife to dance in a garden full of eyes and opinions was not an invitation. It was a reframing. Yes, she said, and the word did not even tremble. He led with precision but not stiffness, which might be the truest sentence one could say about him. The figures of the country dance carried them close, sent them apart, brought them back so that the rhythm itself became a conversation. Adah found she knew where to place her glance and when to change her smile. Andrew found, perhaps to his surprise, that his mouth remembered how to curve without permission. You dance well, she said when the patterns allowed a breath. My mother insisted, he said, and for a heartbeat the boy from the portrait stood with her on the lawn. She said a gentleman who danced poorly would never win a lady's heart. Wise woman, Adah said, trying not to look directly at the warmth in his eyes and giving away the fact that she felt it. The set ended. People clap the way the English clap when they have enjoyed themselves and must not be seen to enjoy themselves too much. Andrew bowed to her, and something like pride moved through him, quick as sunlight, not pride at himself, pride at the fact of them in a world that had not expected this sight. Later, between numbers, people approached them with the kind of remarks that are not apologies but function as such. Adah accepted graciousness where it was offered and answered questions that wanted to be harmless. Andrew took 2 slow turns about the terrace with a cabinet minister who looked at Adah afterward with the faint surprise of a man whose assumptions had been quietly edited. Near twilight, when the air gathered blue at the edges and lanterns began to small their way across the lawn, Eleanor found them again. Walk the terrace before supper, she advised under her breath. Let the room see you being easy together. It will do more than any speech. They walked, not close enough to be a statement, not far enough to be a misunderstanding. On the last turn, when they reached the corner where the stone balustrade framed a view of river and hill, like a painting that had not decided which season to keep, Andrew spoke without looking at her. I am aware, he said, that I have made your first weeks difficult. She glanced up, surprised. You have made them ordered, she said. The difficulty came from the size of the order. He considered that, then nodded. I am learning, he said quietly, as if trying on a softer word. It is not my habit to consult feeling before action. Feeling is a poor map, she said, thinking of her own first morning in the kitchens, and an excellent compass. He turned then, a fraction, enough for her to see that her answer had pleased him. A footman lit the last lantern. The flame found his face, and just for a second, he did not school it. Warmth passed across his features like a bird flying out of trees and into open sky. They went in to supper. If the gardens warmed them, the dining room tested them. There are rooms designed to make people small and rooms designed to let them be exactly their size. This was the latter, and therefore honest. Eleanor placed Adah at her right and Andrew across, where he could be seen without being stared at. Courses arrived like well-drilled soldiers. Conversation advanced and retreated with decorous skirmishes. Adah did not dazzle. She steadied. It turned out steadiness dazzled all the better because no one recognized it until it was already working. A gentleman down the table asked about her father's scholarship. News traveled faster than carriages, and Andrew, without any ceremony, deferred the answer to her. Adah spoke of access and legacy, of minds that could not afford to meet their own promise, And what happens to a country when you invite such minds in? She did not look at her husband while she spoke, but she felt a change then, like a door opening in the vicinity of his ribs. After dinner, music again. Cards. A quiet corner where voices went soft without becoming secrets. Adah stood there a moment alone, comfortable in the ability to be unoccupied without being abandoned. It was a skill no one thought to teach young women until they needed it and did not have it. She had it now. "Duchess," a voice said at her shoulder, not familiar. Mr. Gaines, trim, handsome, the kind of man who prides himself on noticing before he is noticed, bowed. "Might I praise your composure? You handle a room the way a good steward handles a harvest, without waste." "High praise from a gentleman of such observation," she said. "Observation is my business," he said cheerfully, "as is advice when it will be useful. You have won allies tonight. Do not spend them all in one season." "I will be frugal," she said, amused but alert. He tipped his glass and moved on. Adah allowed herself a sip of lemonade and a deep breath. She saw Eleanor across the room, engaged, a commander of the social field. She saw Andrew by the mantel with the minister again, speaking with that focus he reserved for things that mattered. Where she had expected to feel alone in a crowded room, she felt instead accompanied by the quiet fact of him. Eleanor rescued her for a second walk in the cooler hall. "How goes it?" "As you predicted," Adah said. "Half of the promises kept, which is miraculous. And the other half," Eleanor's grin tilted, "will keep themselves later." "You did not tell me your brother would defend me to Lady Hensley," Adah said before she could think to embroider the moment. "I did not know he would," Eleanor said, not hiding the pleasure it gave her. "But I knew he could. There is a difference." They returned to the salon. Another set formed. Couples found their places. Eleanor was claimed by her husband. Adah, left for a breath, watched the floor fill and felt oddly content to be still. "Wife," said the voice that was beginning to mean home. She turned. Andrew stood there, not imposing a claim but offering a choice. "One more?" he asked. "One more," she agreed, aware of the eyes that would turn and the mouths that would make of it something larger than a dance. Let them. This was the first act of their marriage that did not feel like a correction. It felt like an assertion. The music lifted. They moved. Somewhere in the turn and the step, their hands found a pressure that was not instruction. It was information, and they both understood it. When the set ended, applause brushed across them. Andrew escorted her from the floor, and before duty could claim him for some conversation he would accept out of habit, Eleanor appeared as if summoned. "Carriages will be lining up in 10 minutes, she murmured. "Go now, before the crush. Let the last image of you tonight be simple." "What is simple?" Adah asked, half laughing. "Leaving together," Eleanor said. They left together. The night had slipped into the kind of cold that clarifies. Their coach lamps gilded the drive. Steam curled from horses like breath, you could see. The coachman helped Adah in. Andrew followed with that careful economy that meant he did not waste motion on anything that did not matter. For a moment when the door shut and the world became velvet and small, neither spoke. The carriage rocked into motion. Gravel. Then the hush of the open lane. "I am not practiced at this," Andrew said at last, words as bare and true as winter trees. "At what?" Adah asked, gentling her voice without thinking about gentleness. "At letting other people see me." He hesitated, choosing the least dangerous word. Softened. She sat a little forward, the better to hear what he would say next, even if he decided not to say it. "You weren't soft," she said. "You were precise and kind. That is rarer and better." He turned his head toward her. The lamp's swing put light in his eyes and shadow across his mouth. "You are a surprising woman," he said, as if the sentence were both compliment and confession. "Surprising," she echoed, smiling before she could stop it. "You have said that word about me as if the surprise keeps renewing." "It does," he said simply. They rode a while in companionable quiet, the kind that does not need to be filled to be felt, past hedgerows that had memorized the shape of the wind, past a low rise where the stars were so near they seemed to rest on the field like a net. "Your defense," Adah said finally, choosing her own plain word. "At tea. Thank you." "I corrected a falsehood," he said, then added after a breath, "and made a truth visible." She let the carriage carry that sentence for them. Outside, a late owl spoke to the night, and the night spoke back. Harrington's gates appeared, black iron drawn like script against the sky. The coach rolled through. The house rose from the dark with all its windows steady, a lighthouse for people who did not own boats. The carriage slowed, stopped. The footman opened the door. In the moment between lamp and threshold, when the air was colder and the house waited to take them in, Andrew's face unguarded itself again without his permission. And there, clear as a bell struck once, was the almost smile. It was not polished, it was not practiced. It was a beginning. "Good night, Adah," he said, her name quiet and certain in his voice. "Good night, Andrew," she answered and heard what the names made between them. Less winter, more weather that people live in. They crossed the threshold, neither ahead of the other, and the door closed gently on the night. Winter came early that year. The wind that pressed against Harrington Hall carried whispers of frost and wood smoke, and Adah found herself watching the gray skies with the strange contentment of someone who had once feared silence and now trusted it. Each morning she rose before the household stirred, her steps guided by habit more than thought. The kitchens were her refuge still, the one place where steam and scent dissolved rank, where she was not duchess or wife, but simply a woman with a recipe in her mind and warmth at her hands. And though she never expected it, the Duke had begun appearing there as well. At first it was coincidence, then it was curiosity, and now it had become something like ritual. "Lemon again," Andrew observed one morning, pausing in the doorway as the first light turned the copper pots to gold. "Not just lemon," Adah replied, stirring the bright curd that shimmered under her spoon. "Lemon with honey. My mother swore by it for melancholy." He crossed the threshold, slower than most men would, as if politeness itself had learned to walk beside him. "A medicinal pastry, then?" "A restorative," she said, glancing over her shoulder. "If you ever try smiling before noon, I'll prescribe one daily." The faintest curve touched his mouth, gone almost at once, but real. "I see you've mistaken me for a man who requires prescriptions." "No," she said, voice softening. "Just one who might enjoy sweetness when he finds it." He looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that measured more than words could hold, then shifted his gaze to the work table. "Carry on, Duchess. I'll not interfere." But he didn't leave. He stood close enough that she could hear the sound of his breath as he watched her pour the curd into jars, sealing each one with the precision her father once applied to ink. When she offered him a spoonful, his hand brushed hers by accident, or perhaps not, and she caught a flicker in his eyes, that half-startled recognition of warmth after too many cold seasons. "Too tart?" she asked. "Perfect," he murmured, his voice low. Like most surprises, that night she found a small package waiting on her dressing table. Inside was a book bound in deep green leather, embossed with French script. Les Arts Culinaires de Paris. A note lay tucked within, "For your collection. Consider it. Professional reading." It was the first gift he had given her without obligation. And though the handwriting was firm, exact, and unapologetically masculine, there was something unguarded in the simplicity of the gesture that made her heart ache in the gentlest way. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived at breakfast. Andrew read it twice before speaking. "My cousin William is ill," he said finally, setting the paper aside. "Influenza, perhaps pneumonia. He's at his hunting lodge near Cirencester." Adah frowned. "The cousin from Lady Eleanor's gathering?" "The same, foolishly fond of cold air and late nights." He hesitated. "I'll go to him this afternoon." "Of course," she said. Then more quietly, "Shall I accompany you?" He blinked as if the thought hadn't occurred to him, but pleased him nonetheless. "You would endure a snowy journey for my cousin?" "For you," she said, then smiled. "And perhaps for a change of scenery." He considered, then nodded. "Very well, we'll leave by noon. It's not a long drive, and William will be delighted by company that doesn't lecture him." The carriage rolled through a world painted in white. Fields lay blanketed in frost. Hedgerows sparkled with ice like threads of glass. Inside, the air was warm, heavy with the scent of woolen pine. Andrew sat across from her, gloved hands resting on his knees, his posture neat as calligraphy. "Were you close as boys?" Adah asked softly. He smiled faintly, the kind that spoke of memory. William, Eleanor, and I spent summers with our grandmother in Somerset. He was incorrigible. Climbed trees, stole jam, dared me to swim in ponds the color of ink. And did you? Once. His expression turned wry. I nearly drowned. He said it built character. Adah laughed, and the sound filled the carriage with something brighter than warmth. I imagine he's still building it. Andrew's gaze softened. He's one of the few people who knew me before? He stopped, searching for a word that would not betray him. Before I learned restraint. Before the walls, she said quietly. He looked out the window, snow sliding by in endless silence. Yes. A beat passed. Then in a voice more vulnerable than she had ever heard, he added, Sometimes I wonder if that boy would recognize me now. Adah's heart tightened. She reached across the small space between them and laid her hand over his. Perhaps he would be proud of what you built, even if he wished to remind you that warmth isn't weakness. He turned his palm upward, threading his fingers with hers. The gesture was simple, unpracticed, and deeply human. Perhaps, he whispered, the latter might still be possible. They stayed that way for the rest of the journey, hands intertwined, eyes on the snow that blurred past like time itself. William Percy greeted them with a grin that tried and failed to hide exhaustion. His cheeks were pale, his eyes rimmed with fever, but his humor was untouched. Andrew, and the lovely Duchess, he rasped, attempting a bow from his bed. To what do I owe the pleasure of your sympathy? Gratitude that you're still breathing, Andrew said dryly, taking a seat beside him. Barely, William coughed, then winked at Adah. Tell me, Your Grace, has he been as frightfully proper as ever? Or have you found the secret lever that makes him laugh? Occasionally, she said, smiling, usually involving food. William chuckled weakly. Good heavens, the Ice Duke melts for pastry. There's hope for us all. Andrew shot him a look that could curdle milk, but Adah caught the flicker of affection behind it. They stayed 4 days. Adah read aloud when William was too tired to speak. Andrew played chess with his cousin long into the night, the firelight softening the sharp planes of his face. By the third evening, William's fever had broken, and the house felt less like a sick room and more like a refuge. It was snowing heavily outside when Andrew joined Adah in the small sitting room, where she was folding a knitted shawl for the housekeeper's daughter. William is sleeping, he said quietly. He'll recover. That's wonderful news, she replied, her smile genuine. He's a kind man. He is, Andrew agreed, sitting opposite her. The fire threw light between them. Too kind, some would say. They sat in companionable silence for a time, the air humming with unspoken things. Adah, he said finally, may I ask you something personal? Of course. He looked into the fire, not at her. Why did you say yes? To you, she teased gently, trying to ease the tension. He nodded once. The rumors were unpleasant, but hardly ruinous. You could have waited, chosen freely later. She considered. Perhaps I was tired of letting others decide what would ruin me. His eyes lifted, meeting hers. I see. But I think, she continued softly, that something in your proposal felt honest. You didn't pretend it was love. You didn't lie. He exhaled, slow. Honesty has been my only consistent virtue. Then I'm glad I recognized it. Silence again. Thicker now, but not uncomfortable. The logs shifted in the hearth. Sparks rose like thoughts escaping. Would it surprise you, he said at last, if I told you I had noticed you long before that night in Bath? She blinked. Noticed me? At lectures with your father? At the Haywoods gathering? Once at the Royal Crescent? You were different. You looked people in the eye. You smiled without calculation. He paused, voice low. It startled me. Adah's pulse quickened. And when the rumors began, I saw an opportunity, he said simply, to do what was right, and perhaps, selfishly, to find someone who would not fear me. The confession landed between them like warmth in winter. I don't fear you, she said. I never did. He studied her, something unguarded flickering behind his composed exterior. No, you never did. Outside, snow fell in dense silence. Inside, the room glowed gold and red, the fire crackling like a heartbeat. Andrew set his glass down. Adah, he said, voice roughened by something he didn't name. You have changed this house. And me. She shook her head gently. You changed yourself. I just opened a door you'd already built. He leaned forward, close enough for her to feel his breath. Still, you stepped through it. It was the kind of sentence that dissolved all distance. For a moment, neither moved. Then slowly, giving her every chance to turn away, Andrew reached up, brushed a strand of hair from her cheek, and let his hand linger. Her heart stuttered. She had imagined this moment once or twice, against her better judgment, and it had never felt real until now. His thumb traced her jaw. Adah, he whispered as if testing the sound of her name in a new language. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. When he kissed her, it was tentative at first, barely a breath, then deeper, as though the long winter between them had finally broken. She let herself lean into it, tasting warmth, cinnamon, and courage. When they parted, she saw his eyes unmasked for the first time, not the gray of cold stone, but the soft stormlight that comes before spring. This was not what I planned, he murmured, forehead resting against hers. This attachment. Plans change, she whispered back. Sometimes for the better. He smiled then, a real, unguarded smile that transformed him utterly. Outside, snow blanketed the world in silence. Inside, a thaw began. They returned to Harrington Hall 2 days later, William well enough to tease them at the carriage door. Try not to frighten the servants with your happiness, he called after them. Andrew had the audacity to grin. I make no promises. That night, for the first time, he came to her room not as duty, but as choice. The candlelight turned everything soft, forgiving. And though the details belonged to no one but them, what mattered was simple. They met each other not as Duchess and Duke, not as propriety and protection, but as equals who had discovered tenderness was not weakness after all. When dawn crept over the frosted hills, Harrington Hall felt different, alive in a way that echoed laughter more than lineage. The days that followed unfolded gently, like pages turning themselves. Andrew began appearing in the kitchens not only to watch but to help. He learned to fold beaten egg whites without collapsing them, to slice fruit with careful precision, to laugh, quietly but unmistakably, when flour dusted his cuffs. The servants whispered, of course, the iced Duke baking pastries beside his wife? Scandalous, endearing, impossible, and true. One morning, Adah found him standing by the hearth, sleeves rolled to his elbows, studying a recipe card with the same intensity he usually reserved for estate ledgers. Are you conquering chocolate souffle or surrendering to it? She teased. Negotiating, he said gravely. You didn't warn me that peaks collapse faster than parliament debates. They do if you overthink them, she said, smiling. Try trust instead. He gave her a look half curious, half fond. An approach worth testing. When the souffle rose perfectly, light, proud, defying gravity, he let out a triumphant sound so unrestrained that Adah laughed aloud. Success? She asked. Victory, he corrected, grinning, and proof that precision occasionally bows to intuition. It was a small moment, but it carried the weight of transformation. The man who had once measured affection in obligations now measured joy in spoonfuls. One evening near Christmas, Eleanor visited again. She arrived in a swirl of crimson velvet in delighted disbelief. Andrew, she said, sweeping into the library, where her brother was reading beside the fire. Rumor travels faster than truth. I hear you have become, dare I say, pleasant. He raised an eyebrow. A dangerous exaggeration. Not from what Mrs. Fairchild tells me, Eleanor said, grinning. She swears you thanked the cook yesterday. I commended efficiency. You said the pudding was splendid. Andrew glanced at Adah, who hid her smile behind her teacup. Perhaps I was misquoted. Eleanor clapped her hands. Then I shall misquote you again. It suits you. Later, when she and Adah shared a quiet moment, Eleanor's tone softened. He looks at you differently, you know, as though someone opened the windows in a house he'd forgotten had air. Adah felt tears prick, unbidden. Sometimes I think he's learning how to breathe again. Then teach him gently, Eleanor said. Men who've lived too long in silence need patience to trust their own laughter. Adah nodded, her throat tight. He's worth the patience. By the year's final snowfall, Harrington Hall had become a home. The Duke's study, once sterile, now carried the faint aroma of lemon oil and paper. The dining room saw laughter as often as politics, and in the kitchens, the staff no longer stilled when their master entered. They smiled. On Christmas Eve, Adah stood by the tall windows overlooking the courtyard, watching snow fall against the lantern glow. Behind her, Andrew came to stand close, his reflection merging with hers in the glass. "Do you ever think," he asked softly, "how improbable all this is?" "Every day," she said. He turned her gently toward him, his voice low. "Adah, when I proposed, I offered protection and position. I believed love was a luxury for other people. And yet, she prompted, smiling through the shimmer in her eyes. "And yet here I stand," he murmured, cupping her cheek, "undone by sweetness, rescued by a woman who refuses to let life be anything less than warm." She leaned into his hand. "Then don't resist rescue." He laughed quietly, a sound she would come to cherish more than any symphony. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the fields in white. Inside, two people who had once treated marriage as contract now treated it as promise. The ice duke had melted, and in the slow, deliberate heat of love, something stronger than fire remained. By early spring, the snows around Harrington Hall began to shrink into glittering seams of water. The air smelled of thaw and tilled earth. Windows opened again. Servants spoke freely in hallways that had learned laughter. Adah kept a small ledger now, not of expenses, but of lives changed. 6 village children receiving lessons from the tutor she had hired. 4 widows employed in the laundry. 1 scullery girl apprenticed to the cook. The column of difference made grew longer every week. Andrew found her bent over that ledger one morning. "You're more diligent than my steward," he said, setting down a cup of tea. "I'm more motivated," she replied. "Stewards balance books. I'm trying to balance people." He looked at her for a moment, then smiled. "You succeed." Outside, the courtyard filled with the sound of hooves. Eleanor's carriage. Her visits had become monthly rituals, brisk, affectionate, full of stories from London. This time she arrived with less sparkle than usual. "There's talk," she said after supper, lowering her voice. "The former Duke, your uncle, has returned from the continent." Andrew's jaw tightened. He abdicated every duty he owed this family. "True," Eleanor said, "but he intends to reclaim his influence. He's telling London that your marriage diluted the Harrington name." Adah felt the room still around them. Andrew's voice stayed calm, but a new edge glinted beneath it. "He will find we are not his to name." The confrontation came 2 weeks later, abrupt as a storm. The old Duke, tall, silver-haired, immaculate, arrived unannounced, flanked by 2 discreet servants who looked like punctuation marks after his sentences. He entered the library without invitation. "Andrew," he said in the tone of a man greeting a subordinate, "I see you've redecorated. Provincial but comfortable." Adah rose, poised, the Duchess he had dismissed sight unseen. "Your Grace," she said evenly. "Welcome to Harrington Hall." His gaze skimmed her like a ledger entry. "So you're the reason polite society whispers. A professor's daughter playing Duchess." Andrew stepped between them, not as shield, but as declaration. "She is my wife," he said quietly, "and she has restored this estate's honor in ways you never understood." The old Duke's eyes hardened. "Honor is lineage, blood." "Honor," Andrew said, "is conduct." The older man's mouth thinned. "You were raised to preserve the Harrington legacy, not dilute it with sentiment and scholarship." Adah's voice, when it came, was calm enough to cut. "Then perhaps legacy needs new definition." The silence that followed was decisive. The old Duke left the next morning, and gossip found a new shape. Not scandal, but respect. The Ice Duke's marriage had not ruined him. It had made him formidable. Spring deepened. On the first clear day of May, Adah stood beside Andrew in the Great Hall as guests gathered for a different kind of celebration. A banner read, "The Primrose Fellowship for Scholars of Modest Means." Andrew addressed the room with measured grace. "My father built this hall on inheritance. My wife reminded me that inheritance is useless unless shared." Applause filled the chamber, soft but sincere. Adah's throat tightened as she unveiled the plaque, her father's name engraved beneath the Harrington crest. Later, when the crowd thinned, Andrew slipped his hand into hers. "He would have been proud," he said. She smiled through tears. So am I. That night they walked the gardens lit by lanterns strung between budding apple trees. You've given him back to the world, Andrew said, and perhaps yourself with him. Adah squeezed his fingers. You've given me space to do it. By late summer, the scent of apples ripening hung over the orchards, and Adah began to suspect a quiet miracle. The morning sickness, the flutter of exhaustion, the faint tremor of new life, each sign drew her closer to certainty. When she told Andrew, he froze for a heartbeat, then laughed, a sound so pure she would remember it for the rest of her life. A child, he said, voice unsteady. Adah, I've never... She caught his hand. Neither have I. He bent, pressed his forehead to hers. Then we shall learn together. From that day, the household shifted around her with reverent conspiracy. Eleanor sent linen. Mrs. Fairchild orchestrated silence where stairs creaked. Andrew read everything on prenatal care he could find and insisted on accompanying her to every appointment in Bath. He still woke before dawn, but instead of riding, he brewed her tea. You're coddling me, she teased one morning. I'm protecting legacy, he said, half-smile betraying pride. Legacy, she echoed. Or love. Both, he admitted and kissed her palm. Snow returned, soft and forgiving, the way it always did at Harrington Hall. Candles glowed in every window. The villagers came to sing at the gates. Children carried baskets of oranges. Bells from the chapel rang across the hills. Inside, the family gathered. Eleanor radiant, William restored, Mrs. Fairchild pretending not to dab her eyes. Adah, visibly expectant, sat near the hearth while Andrew addressed their guests. Last year, he said, I stood before many of you a man of duty. Tonight I stand as a man of gratitude. I have learned that warmth multiplies when shared, and that strength need not silence tenderness. He turned toward Adah. My wife taught me that. Then, with a conspirator's nod to Eleanor, he stepped forward, took Adah's hand, and went down on one knee. Not for spectacle, but as symbol. Adah Primrose Percy, he said, voice quiet but clear. I married you for honor. I remain beside you for love. Will you renew our vow, not as arrangement, but as promise freely chosen? Tears blurred the world. Yes, she whispered. 1,000 times yes. Eleanor applauded first. The hall followed. Laughter spilled into the music. The Duke and Duchess danced once more beneath the garlanded beams, their steps unhurried, certain. Months later, in early April, the bells of Harrington Village rang again, this time for new life. A son, healthy and strong, born just as dawn struck gold across the orchard. Andrew held the tiny bundle with the awe of a man handling both miracle and memory. He has your eyes, he whispered. And your patience, Adah said, smiling faintly. Eleanor entered, hushed, delighted. What name shall he carry? Thomas Primrose Percy, Andrew said without hesitation, so he may always belong to both of us. Time softened the edges of everything but love. 5 years passed. The orchard grew thick with bloom again. The child, dark-haired, curious, ran between the trees shouting for his parents to look at some new treasure of twig or feather. In the kitchen, Adah finished the last page of a book she had been compiling. The Harrington Household Cookbook. Meals for the heart and the air. Each recipe held a story. Each margin bore a note in Andrew's unmistakable script. That evening, she presented it to him, tied with blue ribbon. He read the inscription aloud. For Andrew Percy, who taught me that warmth is an art, not an accident. He looked up, eyes bright. And for you, he said, who proved that even a heart long frozen can learn to knead and rise. They laughed, the kind of laughter that carries all the tears it replaced, and went out into the orchard, their son darting ahead, the trees trembling with petals. Years from that first cold proposal in Bath, Harrington Hall remained what they had made of it, a living house. Students came to study under the Primrose Fellowship. Villagers came to share harvest feasts. A child grew up between books and bread dough, never once doubting that kindness was strength. On the morning of their 10th Christmas together, Andrew woke early, as he always did, and found Adah already downstairs rolling out dough while snow feathered the windows. Still at it, he said fondly. Tradition, she replied, and breakfast. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, breath warm against her neck. You've turned my entire life into breakfast. Then you're well fed, she teased. He kissed her temple. And still hungry. They laughed, the sound mingling with the crackle of the fire and the soft thump of their son's footsteps overhead. The house, the land, the legacy, all breathed together. Outside, bells began to ring across the valley. Inside, the Duke of Harrington tasted the first tart of the season and smiled. "Perfect," he said, "like most surprises." Adah looked up, remembering a snowy morning years ago when those same words had changed everything. "Happy Christmas, Andrew." "Happy Christmas, Adah." And with the warmth of the kitchen rising around them, the world was, at last, entirely thawed.